Okay, here we are. This is just this. Richard Rohr, I think this is episode like 56 or something crazy like that, 56 or 57. So we've been doing this for more than a year now, and we still got a ways to go, but we are making some tracks. Anyway, we're going to be starting tonight on page 83 with necessary suffering. So please open your books and turn to page 83. That takes you back to some classrooms you'd rather forget. Before we get into the new material, anything from last week? Tony, didn't you say you had something that you wanted to bring up, or has that become moot at this point? Anyone else?
Well, yeah, I did have some things. The question was that I had last week had to do with um, was it a tragedy Jesus dying on the cross?
Mhm.
And the consensus of the group was that it was. Part of me wanted to go do some research, and the only question I can ask is, we looked at it from our point of view, or my point of view of was it a tragedy that Jesus died on the cross, being that, I'm saved by that and that he was fulfilling prophecy. So then my question would be does God see Jesus dying on the cross as a tragedy? That would
Mhm.
be my question. And if I was to answer it, I would say no, my 2 cents.
Okay. Okay. Well, I suppose the way that we answer that question is going to depend on which end of the equation we're looking from. You are looking from kind of a utilitarian point of view. I don't know if you've heard that before, but in philosophy, a utilitarian, in terms of ethics, a utilitarian point of view is going to look at the final result. You know,
Mm.
something is ethical if it creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's a utilitarian point of view. And so you're taking that point of view and saying God would not see that as a tragedy because it had that effect of goodness. But if you take a look at it from the front end, or you take a look at it in the middle, I suppose, it's still a tragedy. It was a tragedy for Jesus himself. It was a tragedy for his family and his closest friends. It was a tragedy. I think the other thing to take a look at too is this question of meaning. Does meaning exist intrinsically in the events that we experience, or do we extract meaning from them? Do we bring the meaning to the events, or is the meaning just there? And that's an important question, I think, for all of us to answer for ourselves, um, because that's going to have a lot to do with how we see the world and how we experience the events that we're going through in life. I think you know it's pretty obvious that um, we are the ones who bring meaning in most instances. I'm not going to say that there is no meaning in the universe itself or in the events that take place. That seems to be what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying. He's saying everything is meaningless. The only thing that makes any sense at all is us just enjoying the time that we have, enjoying our day's work under the sun, enjoying our spouse, and enjoying our children, enjoying our food and drink. That is meaningful in the participation with the moment. But he says everything else is basically meaningless. How you answer that question is going to have a lot to do with how you see events. It'll probably also have a lot to do with how you see your interaction with God. If God is that master puppeteer behind the scenes who is controlling all the events, then you're going to tend to see meaning in those events themselves intrinsically. But if not, if God is present and among us in order to continue to infuse us with the presence and the connection that we need to make our decisions and to go through life, then maybe not so much. Maybe those events don't have intrinsic meaning, but we will take meaning from them as we go through them. And if we feel that way about those meanings, maybe that's going to also encourage us to lean into moments and to find the meaning, to approach even difficult moments with what does this possibly have to teach me? What can I learn from this? Because it's going to be the meaning that I take from it that's going to be important. And the fact that people take different meaning from the same event also kind of points to the fact that we are the ones making the meaning. But I think those are all good questions to ask yourself. You know, what is the truth about meaning in life? Because meaning is going to make the difference between a tragedy and something that you see as useful in your life. Remember that the meaning rationally is not going to be made during the actual event itself. And in the midst of that grief, in the midst of that shock and awe of a traumatic event, that's not going to be the time when you're going to be able to make that meaning, but it'll come afterwards. And actually, that's a point that's going to be made in this section we're going to read today. About when does this actually occur? When can we actually pull meaning from and understand the gravity and the scope of what we're experiencing? And it usually comes with a certain amount of hindsight. But I think that's going to make the difference in how we see this. I don't know, Tony, that there's any right way or wrong way to look at this. It's going to be each one of us approaching this and deciding. But I think the more that we can see life as being meaningful, and even the tragic events as also, bringing us something that we need, this necessary suffering, then obviously we're going to be better equipped to be able to go through life. But it's a great question. And how God sees things, of course, is anybody's guess. We can't know that, you know.
No.
But God would be the ultimate one who can see the beginning from the end, right? And so, if anybody could maybe look past the tragedy to the ultimate good that comes from it, it would be someone with that kind of perspective. But I don't know that God would have hurt any less for any one of us in the midst of the suffering. I don't think God is immune from that. I think God has enough of our qualities of empathy that probably it was experienced as a tragedy in whatever way God experiences things. I don't think we should minimize that, even as we find meaning and maybe eventually become grateful for the tragedies we faced in the past because they have absolutely turned our lives around. So, anyway,
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. It was wonderful. It's how in depth it is. I mean, I connect with the fact that anybody suffering is a tragedy. I get that. Um, yeah, it's the only final question is the fact is tragedy also tied in to time in the event? Is it because I put a time value, and I don't even know how to ask the question. I put a time value on it that tragedy is connected somehow to that. It's because I'm judging that moment, right?
mhm.
But if there wasn't like a time factor, if everything was in the now, which I believe it is, there is no, there's my experiences, but there's no time. Eliminating time just to my experiences and my memories of them and staying in the now, the moment I want to judge or rate or qualify a moment, then it seems to me then um, that I'm actually doing something in a time vacuum or just
That kind of reminds me of Albert Einstein trying to explain relativity when he said, a minute with your hand on a hot stove feels like an hour, and an hour with a pretty girl sitting in your lap feels like a minute. So I think that the quality of the experience does have something to do with it, and the experience of time as well. But if you're asking, if if you are measuring an event against the outcome that you would like to see take place, then obviously we tend to cut the timeline short because we're not seeing the outcome yet. If we could extend that timeline out far enough, and if we keep on showing up to life, we're going to find that everything probably comes back to a positive outcome in the end. It's just like was it Joseph who said to his brothers, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." You know, so if you can extend that time frame out far enough, it's going to come to a good conclusion. But we tend to cut those things short because we're impatient, you know, and we want that outcome now, and we don't see how this event is going to lead to the outcome we want. But I don't know if
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
was the thrust of your question or not.
No, it is. It is. And because it's like, in my mind, I'm assuming, right, that Jesus understood that he was fulfilling prophecy. So he was going into this thing from a position of love, not from a position of tragedy.
Hmm.
And that's why I'm even having this debate. But I don't want to take anybody else's more time. Just
Okay.
that was my crux of last week.
Just a
I,
quick thought to follow up on
yeah,
that.
please, please.
The I was forgot where I heard this or where I got this from, but the idea is that God did not create a meaningless world. We created the meaningless world by
Mm,
looking at the world. Um, and we can extract meaning or not, but once you tap into this God thing, there's always meaning there. Even the you mentioning the timepiece, right? Soon as we put a time limit on things, like that's part of our imposing of meaning or urgency or whatever that involves. And all of those are kind of like egoic constructs
mhm,
Hmm.
that bears little relevance on the God side of things.
mhm. Yeah, well said. Because even as I'm researching all this stuff from last week to this week, part of me is asking, okay, where's my ego in this? Is it because I have to be right? Right? And it's like, right. And then yesterday was wonderful. Dave brought up, it's not that the ego is a bad thing, it's identifying with that ego. And it's like, yeah, that makes sense. But it's like we learn all this stuff, and then it's like, oh, what's going on here? Is this my ego? Is this me? Where's the love in this? There's, you know, now I'm aware of things where I wasn't months ago, right? So brings up a lot of interesting questions.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I love where your mind is going, Tony. Just keep
Keep it
going
going.
down that path. But I mean, for all of us, just be patient with yourself. I mean, there's no way you can really hurry this process except by being aware. You know, it's how many hours a day are you going to practice just being aware? That's the most you can do to hurry the process. Later on, Rohr in this section is going to refer to the parable of the growing seed, and I love that parable. And if you remember, it's the one where the farmer scatters the seeds and then goes about living his life, you know, and everything that is happening in terms of these seeds germinating or not and creating the crop he wants or not happen while he's sleeping and while he's going about his business, but he's not aware of the process at all. But what he did do was start the process to show up and to keep showing up to the parts that he could do and then let the real miracle take place unseen. And that's the crux of the contemplative journey. We show up to a process that doesn't seem to be doing anything. And that's the frustrating part of it, especially at the beginning. And yet things are happening unseen in the background, underground, that we're not even aware of, and until they pop out in various ways. And so to be patient and just stay with the process is the best thing that we can do. And trust that something is happening in places that we don't see. And then when they do pop out, that gives us the encouragement that yes, we have been on the right track. And then the next thing drops, and the next thing, and the next thing after that. And then we start to see the progress. But especially at the beginning, the tendency will be to just discontinue because you're not seeing any events, and you cannot make them happen. You can't push the river. It just does not work. There's no way to push the rope It doesn't, and that's everything that we want to do because we want to be in control and we want certainty. We want to see results and they have to be within our time frame and all of those things. But that's the exact uh, anti antithetical process and thinking to what contemplation is really all about. So it's it is counterintuitive, let's just say. So, okay, let's begin, shall we? Page 83, necessary suffering. Let's see what kind of trouble we can get into tonight. When we try to live in solidarity with the pain of the world and do not spend our lives running from it, there's a good caveat, we will encounter various forms of crucifixion. Pain is merely physical or emotional discomfort, but suffering comes from our resistance to that pain. As others have said, pain is the rent we pay for being human, but suffering is to some degree optional. The soul must walk through such suffering to go higher, further, deeper, or longer. The saints variously called such suffering deaths, nights, darkness, unknowing, spiritual trials, or just doubt itself. Necessary suffering allows us to grow, but in secret. And see Mark 4:26-29. That's the parable of the growing seed, which is an amazingly common concept, both in the teachings of Jesus and many of the mystics. Such growth must largely be hidden because God alone can see it. God alone can see it and steer it for our good. If we try too hard to understand it, we will stop the process or steer it in the wrong direction. It seems there is a cruciform shape to reality, with cross purposes, paradoxes, and conflicting intentions everywhere. Jesus hangs right there amid them, not even perfectly balancing them, but just holding them. This deserves a major wow, because mere philosophy or even proper theology would never have come to this conclusion. Okay, any initial concepts? Something jump out at you? Thoughts?
Well, it seems like what we've been just talking about.
Pretty much, huh, Tony? Yeah.
How
But
is suffering a choice? How is
I'm sorry,
suffering
say
a
again,
choice?
George.
How is suffering a choice? If you're going through something painful, physically, mentally, spiritually, how is that a choice?
Okay. So let's start at the top and get to that. Okay. So when we try to live in solidarity with the pain of the world, all right, solidarity is living in step with, right? In
Right.
connection with, shoulder to shoulder with. So when we try to live in solidarity with the pain of the world, that would mean that we're empathic, right? We're actually aware of, we are feeling it. I think these wildfires have all caused us to have a certain amount of solidarity with the people who are living in those areas and have either lost their homes or don't know whether they've lost their homes and are waiting to be able to get back into their neighborhoods to find out. We're feeling that to a large extent because I know I am, and I've talked to a lot of other people who have. So we're leaning into it. When we try to live in solidarity with the pain of the world and do not spend our lives running from it, that's huge. Because how many of us really do spend our time running from it? We've made a virtue of running from the pain of the world. We count it as evil. We try to pray it away. We question why God would allow such pain to exist as if it was some kind of mistake on God's part or some sort of weak point in God's nature that allowed this to happen. And so as long as we're doing that, we are trying to run from it. We're trying to avoid it. We're trying to push it away. We don't want to think about it. But if we're willing to live in solidarity with the pain of the world, we will encounter various forms of crucifixion. Now, he puts crucifixion in quotes because he's obviously using that as a metaphor. But think about what a crucifixion is. Being nailed to the cross means you're not going anywhere. You are nailed to that place of pain, and there is no escape from it. And that's what he's talking about. Once we decide to live in solidarity, then we're in place. We're not going to be able to avoid it. We're not going to be able to self-medicate it. We will avoid self-medicating it. So many of our addictions and all of whether they're process addictions or substance abuse addictions, they're aimed at not having to feel the impact of the pain, either of our own events or the events of others. And then he goes on to say, and this is going to get to the thrust of George's question, pain is merely physical or emotional discomfort, but suffering comes from our resistance to that pain. So pain is absolutely inevitable. And if you really want to think about it, pain isn't a bad thing. Pain is like the warning light on your dashboard in your car that tells you that there's something wrong under the hood where you can't see it, and you better pay attention to it, or you're going to end up in a ditch on the side of the road. Our pain is telling us that something is wrong, and to remove ourselves from that pain as much as we can so that we can save the limbs, save the this, save the that. So the pain is an important part of our physiological makeup that allows us to survive, right? And it's inevitable. You cannot go through life in any way, shape, or form without pain. It is part of life and a necessary part of life. But now he's going to distinguish that from suffering. And I suppose to a certain, to a certain degree, this is a matter of semantics, how we're going to define these two words. But he's saying suffering comes from our resistance to that pain. Often I found myself telling people, change doesn't hurt at all. Most of us don't like change, but change doesn't hurt. Resistance to change is excruciating. And he's making the same point here. Suffering comes from our resistance to that pain. Now, we were just talking, basically Tony and I were talking about how do we see these painful situations in life? Do we see them in a utilitarian way from the end result? So we can see, hey, there's something that I can learn from this. If we do that, we're still feeling the pain. Because if we weren't, there'd be nothing to learn from it. There would be no singular event that pulls back the curtain of our illusions. But it's going to lessen the suffering to that pain, because we are seeing how we can grow from this. We're already seeing maybe the meaning hasn't congealed in any sort of rational way, but we're still seeing that there's going to be something to come from this that is going to help me in the longer run. Or because we see meaning in the pain, because by shouldering this pain, we're helping somebody else. If I take on this task, if I take on this pain, then somebody else is being sheltered from that pain, or I am making a sacrifice for somebody else. And that lessens the suffering because there is something good coming from it already. That is how the pain is, or the suffering is a choice, because suffering is the way that we are reacting to the pain, the place we put the pain in our makeup, and the meaning that we're drawing from the pain. The pain is inevitable, but the suffering is a choice based on how we view it, philosophically, spiritually, emotionally, and every other way. And then, as he says here, as others have said, pain is the rent we pay for being human. It's just part of the deal, right? But suffering to some degree is optional.
To some degree.
To some degree. Hey,
So,
yeah. We're not
So
going
I
to be able
want
to clear it all away. I mean,
As it just depends
that's
how we're going to
beyond
look at it, and if we're going to wallow, or we're going to, try to figure out what do I need to learn from this? What are you teaching me, God? You know what I mean?
that. Mhm.
You're right. I mean, we're all going to have pain. There's no way to get around it. Suffering.
So I have two examples. One is very, very concrete. It's about my daughter, and I already said this some months ago. So sorry. Okay. So one was my daughter when she was 11. She's now 22, and I said this before. It's a very clear example of pain versus suffering, which is an option. She was crying for 2 hours at 11 years old to get her vaccines, right? So she has several vaccines. She was crying. It was pain and it was suffering.
Mm.
Then she goes to college. Some years later, then she comes back and she has piercings through her ears, her earlobes, the cartilage of the ears, through her nose and the nostril. I said, wasn't that painful? Yes. But there was no suffering because she wanted it. So that's the option, that's the choice. So that's very concrete and very simple. The other one that I know that stood out, and I was writing it there, since when I went through my pain, the pain was there. And I remember talking to my sister about my maternal aunt. So she is about 2 or 3 years younger than my mother. So her husband saw lots of women, had affairs, even had children, 1 or 2 of them from a different woman, and so on. She was in a lot of pain. And now she's in her late 80s. She's an old, bitter, angry woman. Even her children don't want to be with her. We find her very unpleasant. She lives alone. Nobody wants to be with her. And I remember my sister telling me, you don't want to be like her. And I remember saying, no, I do not want to be like her. So going through the pain, and that's when I started searching for help. And I said, I do not want to be like her, because her pain continues to this day. And it's painful for me to see her that way. But it is so unpleasant to be with her. She became bitter, manipulative. Nobody likes her. Nobody wants to be with her. And that's what I mean by the choice we have to make.
Those are great examples, Ellen. I mean, you could probably say with the older woman that the pain has ceased. The pain has long ceased for decades, but the suffering continues, right?
Yeah, even my uncle, through marriage, he already died like 5-6 years ago. He still hangs on to that. And I remember saying, I do not want to be like her.
Great examples.
I think what comes to mind too is like consciousness. To me is like, being conscious of the pain that we're going through will allow us to process it and then come to the other side, allow ourselves to die, like in the crucifixion, and then to be reborn. But if we resist it, we're just kind of putting it off and denying it and not being conscious of it and processing it. And then it just kind of stays unconsciously in our soul and sickens us, and causes suffering.
Any other thoughts? Does that make sense then to you? About the difference we're making here, the difference that Rohr is making here between pain and suffering. So.
And if we don't react so much, we let things pass. Like sometimes I have to be calm, knowing, okay, this is a big mountain, but I'm going to give it to God, and I'm going to trust God to get me through. Because if I look at it too much, at the situation, I'm going to go crazy. And so God just keeps telling me, give me your burden, give it to me. And then I surrender to it. And then the pain is something I can deal with it. I don't suffer so much.
That's great, Carol.
Yeah.
So in a sense, when Carol talks about that particular mindset and the way that she prayerfully goes through difficult times, the pain is something that she has to shoulder as a human being, right? That's all hers. But in a sense, the suffering is being carried by her and God. And so she's not shouldering the whole weight of that anymore, because she has been able to give it. And that's huge. And that's what prayer can do for us. That's what awareness can do for us. Awareness of God's presence can allow us to be able to take part of that weight and let God shoulder it for us. However you conceptualize that.
Another thing I was going to say too that came to mind is forgiveness. I think forgiveness would be almost like a necessary part of moving through the pain consciously as well.
And so that brings up another point. Are we still seeing ourselves as victims And this is huge. So when something painful happens, typically we're victimized, right? Unless it was something that's a consequence of our own choice and our own action, I suppose we're still victims of our own choices in a certain sense. But most of the time that something painful happens, we didn't have any control over that. It just happened. We didn't have any choice in the matter. It just happened. And so we're victimized in that moment. But Sarah's bringing up the idea of forgiveness now. Forgiveness is the freedom that is reestablished when we are freed from our sense of victimization. In the case of the elderly woman that Ellen was talking about, that person is living as a forever victim, continuing to blame others around her for the pain and suffering that she still feels. But if we can release that, then we are no longer victims. And when we're no longer victims, that means we have other choices that we can make, and we actually make those. And at that point, the suffering starts to dissipate, even if the pain is still there. And so, that spiritual, psychological component of suffering, as apart from the pain, even though pain can be emotional as well as physical, there's a line there that needs to be drawn. But I think you're starting to get the sense of this, right?
Really, the research on resilience captures this. It's really interesting to me. There's three components that they have identified in the person who's resilient, the person who deals well with infirmity, for whom the prognosis is always better, the person who responds better to tragedy, to losses. And the three components are: one is acceptance, the ability to accept the situation and to continue on, even if they don't know where it is that they're going. Just putting one step in front of another, one day in front of another. The second component is some system of meaning. So this thing may not mean something right now, but they are plugged into some system of meaning. So there could be hope that meaning may come from it. And the third is grace, is forgiveness. So it's funny, it kind of touches on the things that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. That's such a succinct way of putting it. Okay. So you've got the acceptance, you've got meaning, and then you've got forgiveness, which is the release of victimhood. And that's perfect. That's the process, that's the journey through all of these. That's the journey through suffering. It's not necessarily just a journey through pain. Pain will stop whenever the pain stops. But our ability to deal with the pain, our ability to move through it is exactly that. And yeah, so you just kind of summarized the whole last 10 minutes. Why didn't you do that at the beginning, Brady? We could have.
Sandbagging.
That's great.
It just occurred to me. Well, what I actually was thinking about is my doctors in Houston. I mean, I've been going there for years, and these are really great people. And to a person, at some point or another, we've had this discussion about the prognosis of the men and women who come in there diagnosed with cancer. And it's pretty clear line of distinction. The person who comes in is very depressed, who isn't real motivated for treatment, doesn't want to take the risk or do the difficult things to get through treatment. Prognosis is poor. The person who comes in and accepts the diagnosis and essentially is asking the doctor, okay, what do we do? Prognosis is so much better. And so I think it's kind of the same thing, is that by holding on to pain and holding on to the despair and getting stuck in it and continuing to suffer, it's not only difficult for the person, but probably harmful.
Absolutely.
Certainly harmful.
It's sort of become a cliche that you don't approach happiness directly, right? The butterfly of happiness. You can't chase it, but if you're quiet, then it sits on your shoulder, right? That whole sort of thing. But the idea is that happiness really comes from the inside out and not from the outside in. Abraham Lincoln is credited with saying that most people are about as happy as they choose to be, and I think that's absolutely true. Happiness is not going to come from our circumstances. Happiness is what we bring to our circumstances. And I think we can probably say the same thing about suffering in the way that we're looking at suffering right now. Suffering also comes from the inside out. Pain comes from the outside in, but our sense of suffering comes from the inside out. And so just as happiness is the byproduct of us bringing our full selves and engaging and immersing in moments, then I can say suffering is going to have the exact same trajectory. It's going to come from our failure to immerse in the moment and to continue to move forward and take those steps and everything that Brady was just talking about in terms of prognosis. So these are our choices. We can choose to be happy, engaged, content, right? We can't choose pain or not. We can't choose favorable circumstances or not. We can work toward them, but we can't guarantee them. But our reaction to them is our own. And that's something that we can work on. And so this is the idea of optional and inevitable in terms of pain and suffering. So now he's going to build on this idea. So he says in the next paragraph, the soul must walk through such suffering to go higher, further, deeper, or longer. The soul must walk through the suffering. The saints variously called such suffering deaths, nights, darkness, unknowing, spiritual trials, or just doubt itself. Now, here's maybe feel like a little contradiction or a paradox to you. We just said that suffering is going to be pretty much an optional choice for us, right? The pain is inevitable, but we're going to choose how much we suffer. Then why does the soul have to walk through that suffering if it's really our choice anyway, in order to go higher, further, deeper, or longer? Why would that be? Shouldn't it be something that we can sort of choose away?
You picked the wrong word, Dave.
What's that?
It should say pain, not suffering in that first sentence.
No, I think he's very deliberately using suffering. The title of the section is Necessary Suffering, not necessary pain, necessary suffering. But when I first read that, I said, well, that sounds like a bit of a contradiction, right? It's certainly counterintuitive, but I think there's a very real reason why he's making that statement.
I think it makes sense.
Okay, go for it.
Well, okay, so I'm thinking about Paul and his thorn in the side, or thorn in his flesh, or whatever. Right. It's like, so the remedy for that would not be for God just take the thorn away, and now that somehow has changed Paul. That wouldn't change Paul. It's feeling the pain and knowing the thorn is there, and being able to go through it to God, to not let it prevent him from doing what he's doing. That is what I see as the merit in it. For someone who is struggling with sobriety, the solution to that is just to become sober. Don't drink. That's not it. You have to go through the difficulties, temptations, the voice in your head. You have to go through that to get to the other side. So it makes sense to me.
It does, but I think, even with that example of Paul, the thorn was the pain.
Yeah.
His resistance to the thorn that resulted in his praying to God over and over to relieve him of it and not getting that outcome was his suffering. Why did he need to go through the suffering? It's obvious why he needed to go through the pain. There was no way around that. Why did he have to go through the suffering? Why did he have to struggle with God through that? Why is that necessary?
From my personal experience, now it's going to 7 years when my pain started. My suffering was there for about 6 years. I had to go through it to get to the other side. And I know that because I've compared notes with other women who were in the same boat as me. a couple of the ladies, they go to parties, they go to bars and drinking. One wants to go on a date, and one's so they're masking. The way I see it now, years later, they're masking the pain or the suffering. 7 years later, I'm in a better place, and I can see the difference. I no longer have this longing and yearning for another person to complete me. I'm happy by myself, and I would not have imagined this 6 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
1 year ago, 2 years ago. There was that longing and yearning. I'm having the best time of my life. I found joy, but I had it's and in the and you're saying about acceptance and suffering. I was in denial for 6 years, and that was pure suffering. And I remember the day I finally went into acceptance. It didn't come in one day, but it took several months and years. But yeah, that was the release, the acceptance. But I didn't know it then.
So I think we're all saying the same thing here. And so let's just put our finger right on it and say, let's face it, when we first encounter pain, we're going to resist it, right? I mean, that's just the natural human. We're not going to welcome it. We're not going to be glad about it. We're going to resist it. And we're going to want to pray to God to take it away. And the more traumatic the pain is, the more we're going to resist it. We need to walk through the suffering until we don't resist it anymore. That's the whole point of it. We have to walk through the suffering, walk through the resistance, lean into that resistance until we finally get to the place of acceptance. Because once we can get to that place of acceptance, then the suffering can dissipate. And we've learned something about ourselves at that point. And there's no other way to learn it except by the experience of pushing through the resistance and getting to the other side of that resistance. It's not just the pain, it's our resistance to the pain, our maybe unconscious programming and philosophy about pain and suffering that we're pushing through. And that is getting recalibrated. We're making new meaning on the other side of it that expands us and allows us to accept more. But then the next tragedy hits, and then we have to go through the process again. But it's by pushing through our resistance to the pain, to the trauma, to the loss, that actually is what grows us. And we have to get to the place where we're not resisting. But that we would like to, I mean, there is a cumulative effect to all this, so that the next tragedy that comes down, we can handle it better than we would have if we hadn't gone through the previous one. But it's still going to feel like a tragedy, and we're still going to feel that resistance again, right? I mean, that's just the way that we're wired. That's human experience. But every time we push through the resistance of the suffering of another painful experience, we're growing and gaining more and more expansion, and we're able to handle more and more. And so that's the way we grow. And it would be nice if it was another way, a kinder, gentler way, but this is the way it is. And maybe there is no other way. Otherwise, why would God put us through this, right?
There definitely is a complexity to all of this. For me, when I think of the thorn, real quick here, I see it as a mechanism that God uses with me for a dependency on Him, because it drives me towards Him. That's what the thorn, my thorn, I think we all have thorns, but that's what my thorn does. And it helps control my ego. Not sure what was going on with Paul.
Yeah, Paul was going through it, that's for sure. And remember that the heading of this section is necessary suffering. So Rohr sees all this as absolute necessity. If we are going to grow, if we are going to grow closer to God, if we are going to grow in terms of our ability to see solidarity and unity with everything and everyone around us, then there is no other way than to go through this process. Jesus was not exempt. He had to go through the process as well, and each one of us does. So continuing on, he says, necessary suffering allows us to grow, but in secret. And then he references the parable of the growing seed that we talked about earlier. And remember, the seed is scattered, but everything that happens in terms of the seed actually growing is not in the consciousness of the farmer, of the gardener. He plants the seed. He puts it in the proper place. If there was any tilling that he had to do, okay. But if he was just scattering seed on the hillside, then they basically just threw the seed and waited to see what would happen. I mean, there really wasn't any farming as we consider farming in the rocky hillside terrain that covered most of the Galilee. And so we're just talking about you're literally scattering the seeds. Some of it falls amid, the beaten path, the story of the four soils, right? Some in the rocky ground, some among the reeds and then weeds, and then some in the good soil. But you don't have any control over that. You just scatter the seeds. It would cost you much more to try to pinpoint the good soil than it was for the farmer just to scatter the seeds. And so all this is happening without the farmer knowing how it happens, when it happens. He's just witness to the final result. And so this is amazingly common concept, he says, both in the teachings of Jesus and many of the mystics. Such growth must largely be hidden because God alone can see it and steer it for our good. If we try too hard to understand it, we will stop the process or steer it in the wrong direction. And I think that also is when you read the various teachers on centering prayer and contemplative practice, they're honing in on this point over and over again. Thomas Keating was huge on this, where he said, when you go into, for instance, a centering prayer sit or a meditational sit, you don't bring any agenda to it. You don't bring any notion of an outcome that you're looking for it. You don't bring a question that you want God to answer or revelation to you to it. Because as soon as you're trying to steer it, you're killing the whole process. And that's what he's basically saying here. If we try too hard to understand it, that is maybe better to label it in some way that we want. Again, we're trying to control it then. We're trying to make this thing fit, trying to put the square peg in the round hole, push the rope. We either stop the process altogether or we end up steering it in a wrong direction.
You think you could address the in secret a little bit? Is that so that, I mean, I'm looking at everybody here on the screen, I'm thinking, oh wow, we all have this secret going on. There's this, right?
No. Secret just means that you're not conscious of it while it's happening. It doesn't mean that God is holding it in secret or trying to withhold anything from you. It's just that it's going to happen that way. It's kind of the idea of a watch pot that never boils. If you are waiting for and watching and trying to direct a certain outcome, it's what you think the outcome should be as the result of all your spiritual practice and your piety and everything. Again, I keep coming back to that wonderful image from Merton, making contemplative faces at yourself in the mirror. You're trying to be exactly what you think the mystic is supposed to be, the contemplative is supposed to be, and you're trying to be that. But by doing that, you are completely antithetical to the whole process itself, which is to get yourself out of control. The whole point of contemplative practice is to step out of control, step out of the whole egoic process and experience something that can only be experienced outside of, of that rational mind.
There's like a foolish freedom going on there.
I suppose you could say that, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just let it happen because you're not going to control it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see it as a positive thing that you can be free. If you can find that and maintain that.
Absolutely.
The
there's
other
something
side
else
of
that came to mind when I was reading this. I don't know, are you all familiar with the phrase spiritual bypassing?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Have you heard of that before? So what spiritual bypassing is, it's the use of spiritual either concepts or principles or even just cliches that allows you to bypass the deeper emotional and spiritual work that absolutely needs to be done. It's like just dropping a cliche on a spiritual cliche. Oh, that, God meant for that to happen, or God is going to do this for us, or God needed that to happen. Everything happens for a reason. We just kind of drop this cliche on there rather than acknowledging that we need to lean into the resistance. We need to lean into and experience the pain and go through the deep spiritual work and emotional work that needs to be done. Just because we convert to a particular faith like Christianity doesn't mean that all of that work, psychological work, all of that unconscious programming is suddenly going to be done away with. Spiritual bypassing is saying, oh, just because I am now baptized, I'm a new creature in Christ, and I'm cured. Everything is fine. When we try to label what it is that we're doing with a contemplative practice, to me, it's kind of a form of spiritual bypassing. We are trying to bypass the actual step-by-step showing up and the day-to-day work that the farmer has to do in order to finally get to the harvest. But without that diligence, without that daily showing up, and just doing the day-to-day, mundane, seemingly boring and insignificant chores, we never get to that harvest. And if we try to bypass this by labeling it or making it go where we think it needs to go, then the process never has a chance to take place. It's an abandoning ourselves to the process and realizing that we're not going to be aware of the changes that take place. The significant changes take place at a level that we're not conscious of. They will bubble up into the consciousness. They will show up in our choices. They will show up in the lack of offense or anxiety that we feel as we're going through life. We will notice the changes eventually, and others will probably notice them before us, but it happens like the seed underground, not something that we see. So in secret doesn't mean that anyone is withholding it from us. It's just the nature of the process.
Years ago when I was in therapy, I learned like I could have two emotions going on at the same time. But after reading this chapter, what I'm realizing now is there might be millions of things that are going on with God that I have no clue about and will never understand. I just can't. It's beyond me. Don't even try.
You do get to a point where it all makes a certain kind of sense, but it's not necessarily rational, but it makes sense. And you just get to a place where it just starts to feel comfortable. It feels content. You realize you have hit a kind of balance that you didn't have before. And you may or may not be able to tell anyone how you got there,
You just know it
except by
fits.
that just showing up, right?
The shoe fits where
Last paragraph. It seems there is a cruciform shape to reality with cross purposes, paradoxes, and conflicting intentions everywhere. Jesus hangs right there amid them, not even perfectly balancing them, but just holding them. This deserves a major wow because mere philosophy or even proper theology could never come to this conclusion. In other words, what he's saying there is that it doesn't get resolved rationally. Reality doesn't get resolved. It doesn't get tied up with a bow at the end of a 1 hour episode on television. It just doesn't work that way. That's what we want. We desperately want that to happen, but life doesn't work that way. That cruciform shaped reality is the paradox that he's talking about. You just hang there. Like I said, if you are experiencing a crucifixion, it's because you've been nailed to the cross and you're not going anywhere. And if we allow ourselves to stay put between the horns of the paradox, between the horns of the seeming contradiction, and experience that. Don't be quick to try to resolve it and just choose a side and flop down to one side or another. Then we remove all the possibility of learning by pushing through the resistance to the suffering that we feel. And so just holding the space, getting on the hot seat and staying on it long enough and not trying to skitter off because it's too uncomfortable, but staying in that place and pushing through it to the other side, allowing ourselves to feel everything that we need to feel, allowing ourselves to be present to our pain and the pain of others. All of that is what this process is all about. And it doesn't resolve as neatly or as quickly as we would like, but it will make its own spiritual sense at some point.
Dave, when you mentioned the in secret part earlier, it made me think of one of Rohr's earlier lines, like God has no grandchildren or something along those lines, like this idea that whatever the meaning or the message or growth that we derive from our struggles, our suffering, is going to be completely individual. And, it might as well be in secret because we can't really share that with other people in a way that is not completely personal, right? Like it's very much an individual thing for all of us as we go through our suffering, basically.
Absolutely. We can't transfer it, I think is what you're getting at. It can't be transferred. It can't be bestowed. We can't read it out of a book. The only way this works is to experience it ourselves. That doesn't mean there's no value in trying to express it and to read it and to do exactly what we're doing here, which is talking about it, because all of that can give us confirmation as we get into the experience of it ourselves, that all this stuff rings and we realize, okay, I mean, I'm not either crazy and I'm not off in left field someplace. What I'm feeling now is what everybody feels, and it's what I'm supposed to be feeling. I just need to stay the course. Just stay here, be calm, be trusting that God is with me every step.
Diane, one of the things this brought to my mind too was at an earlier stage in my life, I was really fixated on trying to immediately resolve conflicts that were between myself and my kids or myself and Jim. And I would try and really strive to resolve a past conversation and a present conversation. And I started realizing that at some points in time, sometimes I was able to do that. We got to a better place, but other times it didn't. And then I was left with that uncertainty and the journey that I had to undertake to confront that, and my own feelings about what had happened and where I went with it and my own thinking. Was that a failure? What did I do wrong? If I had said something different, that it would have gone differently. And it was all stuff from the past that was coming up for me, ringing memories of my childhood issues, trying to rescue my mother from her alcoholism or what have you. And I think I realized, and Al-Anon helped me a lot over the years that I had been going and have still been going. And sometimes, I'll tell newcomers that come into the meeting that, my experience with, coming into these rooms and over the years is that it's a program of immersion, that I didn't get a lot of stuff right away, but I kept coming back. I heard stories. I started realizing I wasn't alone. There were other people that were sharing some of the difficulties I had. There was a community in place. We were sharing our own pain with each other when it was a really good meeting. And that helped me enormously in ways that I think his thing about being it in secret, I didn't realize, I couldn't explain exactly what had gone on until I started seeing, in combination with meditation and centering prayer and and talking it out with people that I trusted, that it was coming together. I was flowing more with circumstances. I wasn't trying to force solutions. I was returning when I was to a conversation when I was invited back. And then there was an openness and a free-spiritedness and more compassion that I had, both for myself and for the other person. And, it is an interesting journey. And I started realizing I just had to let it go, that I didn't understand it exactly. And it was hard to articulate. I would agree with you there, Dave. But we see that. And, it reminded me too of Paul's journey that you can see over the course of his letters, from his thorn in his side and his anxiety and his pushing for solutions and, we got to do this. And he was a force of nature in his early years, it seemed like. But boy, towards the end of his life, wow, he was a way more transformed human being, and really seemed to reflect and model Jesus's hanging there on the cross and all of the 7 things he said, to take care of others, to Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. I mean, holy cow, he did it. He moved through that suffering, the pain, everything that was involved in that, when there was cross purposes and paradoxes and conflicting intentions everywhere.
Well, one of the things that I think is so amazing and so necessary is that, Judy is talking about how she has experienced this change in secret, and Jesus is telling us exactly the same thing. So 2,000 years ago, Jesus, who we revere, he had to go through the same experience. And he tells us the parable that is trying to illustrate that experience he had of the change in him taking place without really his conscious awareness or say so, but to keep showing up, that wilderness process, 40 days and 40 nights, just showing up, and doing what he did. And then it doesn't stop there. He was always going to the lonely places to pray because he was going back to show up and to keep showing up to the process. And he's showing us with his life and his teaching exactly this is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. This is how you're still on the way to your Father. And so it's a beautiful thing to see it being preserved for us in Scripture. And then we can take our experiences and lay them against that and against each other and books like this and whatever. And we can start to see how we as humans share all this in common. And that's how we learn from each other. But it does not ever take away our own responsibility for our own experience. We have to have that. It's the only way that this works. So, all right, we better stop there. It's really late. William got to go to bed.
I think it's really fun just to be human.
Thank you for
At
that,
moments.
Isn't it lovely?
Okay, Scotty.
Lord, thank you for this night and this exploration of different concepts and ideas. And you continue to pour out your love into our life. And we're grateful for that. We're grateful for each other's company and encouragement. And just look forward to learning more. So it's in your holy and precious name, Lord Jesus, that we pray and we give our thanks and we say our amens.
Amen. All right. Great discussion, everybody. Oh, look at. Hi, Tony. And
Ew.
little one.
Oh,
She is so cute. Hi, dear. Hi, Rosemary.
that Rosemary.
That's great. Oh, very beautiful. All right. All right. We'll see you all Sunday.
Good night.
Okay,
Good
good
night,
night, guys.
everybody. Have a good one.
Take
Bye
care,
bye.
Georgie.
Good night. Good night. Good night. See you.
Everybody see you.
Bye, George. Bye, Scott.
Bye, Dave.
Good night, guys.
Kathy,
I'll see you Sunday.
and you too, Jordana. See you Sunday.
Okay, bye.
Hey, dear. Bye-bye.